Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. This is Emily Nagel from WRI. I'll do just a quick bit of introductions and housekeeping before we get started, and then we'll pass it over to Todd. So with the CCG being an exclusive and nimble small group, we really hope that these webinars can not only present you with relevant and new information from WRI, but also can be a dialogue among your CCG peers. So there's two ways that you can engage throughout the webinar. Throughout the presentation, Todd will check in for questions. We have everyone muted to start. You can always take yourself off of mute to ask questions or use either the chat or raise your hand feature that's built into our webinar platform here, and I can facilitate those questions for you. So presenting our webinar today, titled The Business Case for Preserving Water's Natural Infrastructure, we have Todd, who I hope many of you have met, Todd Gartner, a senior associate at WRI, who is the manager for our Natural Infrastructure for Water program. He'll walk us through and give us some opportunities for engagement and dialogue on the subject, and we hope to hear from you. So with that, Todd, if you'd like to take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily, and really appreciate all of our CCG members and other corporate partners joining the webinar today. I am based out in Portland, Oregon, where my daily life is getting to enjoy natural infrastructure. Spent much of the weekend snowboarding, constantly thinking about how the friction on my snowboard impacts the melting snow, which will ultimately end up being the drinking water for Portland, Oregon. And much of what I'm going to cover today is that connection between two of WRI's core programmatic areas, our forest program and our water program, and ultimately how those connections impact a third core area, which is sustainable cities. So when we talk about natural infrastructure and its relation to water, I'm really referring to what the grand we can do in our rural landscape in terms of restoring forested systems, improving the way that we manage our agricultural lands, conserving key ranch and wetland areas, all for water-related benefits. So think about mitigating the impacts of many of the priorities of our partners and friends in the corporate sector. And what I'd like to do is kind of break the presentation into sort of 5 subcomponents, and each one will be pretty short. Really just make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what this topic is all about, and then really dive into kind of the core enabling pieces that are going to make this type of approach, natural infrastructure for water, a reality. How do we inspire decision makers, whether in the corporate sector, government, or financial institutions? How do we think about the enabling conditions and ingredients to put this, on the policy platform? How do we understand where the money is going to come from? And then how do we move from what is currently some really cool pilot level initiatives to really scale this up, integrate into policy, and get real investment behind it? So with that, let me kick it off, and I'll pause periodically throughout. And as Emily mentioned, please feel free to raise your hand or put your questions in the text box. And then after the presentation, we'll have more of a consolidated time for question, answer, and discussion. So starting off, many of you are unfortunately well aware of the water stress reality across the globe. When you think about where your facilities are located, where your supply chain is operating, I'm sure that water risk in terms of water availability and the usability of that water is one of the key ingredients that you're thinking about within your sustainability and risk offices. Unfortunately, when you think about what the world will look like in 2030, in terms of the impacts of climate change, of urbanization, of the need to grow more food, the water risk in a majority of the places that is red on this map are going to get worse, and many of the places that are in the orange and yellow are going to trend towards red as well. So water risk is key, and it's critical for all of your business needs. And unfortunately, it's not just businesses, it's people as well who are going to be dramatically impacted. Much of the most acute and high-risk water stress is highlighted in areas where you have some of the largest human populations. This is a map of the Atlantic Forest region in Brazil, and you can see Sao Paulo, Rio, Salvador, etc., having some of the greatest water risk. So in terms of economic growth, human well-being, there is a clear connection between water risk and a prosperous society. The way that we have tried to deal with this water risk over the last 50 to 100 years has been to build our way out of these challenges. More reservoirs, more sophisticated treatment facilities, more dams and dikes, and the like. And we've gotten pretty good at doing this, but a majority of our built infrastructure was built well over 80 years ago with an anticipated lifespan of 50 or so years. So there's a huge need to replace and upgrade existing infrastructure. And then if you look at the water infrastructure needs moving forward, there will be something like 10x the level of current infrastructure will be put in online over the next 30 years. So most of the water infrastructure for the next generation has not been built yet. So how do we think about a smarter way than just cement, pipes, and concrete? And this is all in the context of what is happening in our natural systems. So if you unfortunately look at the increasing number of pink dots on that map, that shows where there's been forest loss in key watersheds in Brazil, which ultimately feed many of those cities which I showed a few slides back. So there's going to be less available water, more people needing that water, and the infrastructure where that water is ultimately being derived, our forest and agricultural systems, is being lost and degraded. So the idea of natural infrastructure is not moving entirely away from built systems. That is irresponsible and not very pragmatic, but rather thinking about how an integrated, hybridized approach of natural systems, natural infrastructure, green solutions can complement and enhance our already built and what will ultimately be investments towards the gray infrastructure side. And when people talk about this green and gray approach, there's ultimately or usually three core areas that are highlighted to why this makes sense, whether you are a city planner, whether you are a semiconductor plant operator, whether you're operating a food and beverage company, an apparel company, technology company. Water and water infrastructure has major implications on your costs. So if we successfully integrate green and gray systems, the evidence suggests that both upfront and periodic capital expenditures can be dramatically reduced. The operations and maintenance costs of those systems can be greatly reduced, and the periods in which you need to then replace existing infrastructure can be dramatically delayed. And this is true whether you own and operate your own water infrastructure or whether you're reliant upon municipal water systems. There are major cost savings that have been demonstrated when this is done well. We often hear a lot about the need to think about what the future is going to look like and how we make decisions in the face of uncertainty. When you build in natural systems to complement your gray build side, you inherently increase your flexibility and enhance the level of climate adaptation and resilience of your system. Again, that points to lower costs and more options as we learn what the future has in store. And finally, I know that everyone on this line has corporate water stewardship goals. Some of them may be what you can do specifically within your own four walls. Others will look at collective action opportunities and how you engage with other stakeholders, whether in the city or rural areas across your supply chain, of ways that you can think about what water sustainability looks like for your company and consortium by 2030. You go up one level and you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, and the idea of engaging and incorporating green and gray can ultimately help many companies address both. So if it's cheaper, if it offers more flexibility, and if it's geared towards meeting both your corporate level goals and broader societal goals, why have we not seen the level of investment and scaling necessary to address the problem in front of us? We've done a lot of thinking around this and tried to really capture some of the core challenges in 6 steps. And you can divide this in lots of different ways. But ultimately it starts by lack of awareness. Many of the water infrastructure decision makers and investors were trained in very traditional engineering. So the idea of thinking beyond the concrete and steel solution sets oftentimes is not right in front of them in the handbooks that they utilize. We're beginning to make strides in that regard. Not having a clear business case. So what is the ultimate return on investment of incorporating green systems? And I'll work through that quite a bit. Where does the money actually come from to finance these infrastructure opportunities? It's not cheap. Many of the traditional infrastructure platforms are not oriented right now to think more in an innovative fashion, but we're beginning again to make strides in that direction. And then ultimately, how do you put this into reality? This is very much outside of the wheelhouse of most corporate entities. You need to work with lots of stakeholders from different sectors. How do we pull those pieces together? And then think about this as not just something neat that we can point to in one watershed in New Mexico or Florida, but something that has replicability and scalability across your entire portfolio. So I'm going to run through sort of the way that WRI envisions moving this from something that is theoretical to something that is being done at scale. And we do that by inspiring, enable, figuring out the financing mechanisms, and then ultimately trying to tie these success stories into policy application. So the first piece is really around raising awareness and providing the evidence base and information for those that are making the decisions and ultimately looking for more cost-effective solutions. And what we hear oftentimes from investors is that there's simply not a pipeline of investment-ready projects. And when we talk to project developers, we often hear, we've got tons of projects, just no access to capital. And unfortunately, many people think about these projects after some form of a catastrophic event, a major wildfire around the drinking water source for San Francisco, huge drought issues, floods, and the like. But what we're trying to do at WRI with our partners is be more systematic and proactive and identify where there may be a pipeline of deals on the front end, and how many of the companies on the line can look across their portfolio and begin to prioritize where this green-gray water infrastructure approach may make sense. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to a tool that we launched just a few months ago, which is called Global Forest Watch Water. And it brings together 2 key tools which many of you may be familiar with through your prior engagement with the CCG and WRI. It brings together Aqueduct, the most granular global water risk tool available, and Global Forest Watch, using satellite imagery to track near real-time forest change and impacts on the landscape. And ultimately, what we allow a user to do is to, first and foremost, know their watershed. So you can drop a pin anywhere in the world at your intake location, at one of your facilities, at key areas of your supply chain, and very quickly understand what is happening in your watershed. Where is it? What's the size? How many miles of stream? Where are the wetlands? Where are the dams? What are the key infrastructure-related elements that are most important for water ability to sustainably operate in that area. And then depending on which risks are most acute for each of your facilities or components of your supply chain, we're able to give you contextualized suggestions for how you might think about mitigating these risks. So it's global information contextualized down to a decision-relevant scale across your portfolio and done in such a way that the results are easy to communicate across your organization and to share with key decision makers. So you're making information on near real-time information at a scale that is absolutely relevant. And we think it's going to be, well, we've already seen it to be extremely relevant for corporations, for utilities, and other major downstream beneficiaries. But we're also seeing entities like the World Bank, the Green Climate Fund, the Goldman Sachs of the world, really looking at how this might help inform their water infrastructure investment decision making for the next 10 plus years. And then I know we have some folks on the line who aren't necessarily as focused on being a downstream beneficiary, but are much more on the land management side. They're either owning or operating or investing in forest and agricultural systems. This can very quickly help you understand how your lands compare to other land operators, either in that region or across the globe, how your actions are potentially benefiting or impacting downstream beneficiaries, and where there's opportunity for collective action. So what I'd like to do is just quickly run you through one example for Global Forest Watch Water. So what you can do is drop a pin at a point anywhere in the world. So for this, I'm going to pick Fort Collins along the Front Range of Colorado. So you drop a pin right at the intake location, which we're able to identify for the city of Fort Collins. The tool automatically models out where your watershed is in terms of where your water is being provided for the city. And on the right gives you a very quick indices of the risks within your watershed. You are able to then download, save, and share all of the critical information for that watershed. The total size, the land cover, where the wetlands, lakes, reservoirs are located, where the built infrastructure is pieced together, so you'll have detailed maps as well as these statistics. On the risk side, there's a couple of things we're able to do. All of those pink dots show you where there's been tree cover loss over the last 14 years. You can then see how it has changed each year and when there may have been a pulse of activity. So that 2012 huge pink bar was when there was a major catastrophic wildfire which had huge implications on the water quality for that region. And you can see at the top left, we've given that a score of a 5 out of 5, extremely high risk. We understand that there's a lot of negative impacts to the watershed that occurred before satellite imagery. So we're able to model out where forest cover change happened before the year 2000 and provide a risk score around that. Where in the watershed is the greatest erosion risk? Where are the fires and how frequently do they occur? Now, of course, it's the middle of the winter right now, so there's no active fires, but if you had this for the middle of September, you would likely see red dots suggesting where all of the active fires are at that time. And then what is the baseline water stress in that region? So very quickly you understand the current conditions and trends. Now, there were a couple of risk indicators, recent tree cover loss and fire, which came out as extremely high for that watershed. We point you to economic analyses, financing applications, case studies, ongoing programs that are similar and have successfully mitigated or reduced the impacts of these solutions. What I'd like to do is just give you an example of how we've applied this with a core partner at the Department of Defense and how I think this is replicable for many of the companies on the line who have operations across the country or across the globe. So we mapped out all of the Department of Defense's installations, 400 and some odd across the U.S. And by going through all of those different risk indicators, plus a number of other conditions that they were most concerned with, we were able to go from a number of about 550 down to less than 20 where they really needed to be paying attention. So if you think about your supply chain, where you have assets, we think that we can help you really prioritize which ones have the greatest risk related to water and watersheds, and where can this idea of natural infrastructure play a cost-effective solution. So let me just pause there for a moment and see if there are any kind of core questions based on what I've described so far.
And again, here, if anyone on the line does have a question, you could go ahead and unmute yourself locally and ask the question out loud, or I'm happy to take questions through the chat.
All right, well, let's just keep moving, and as questions come in, we will take them as we go. So let me go back to the big screen. So one of the things that we've really been able to clarify is the messenger is as important as the message itself. And thinking about how we can take the big data and make it as clear as possible in the form of spatial analysis and maps is key to getting action. So I'd love for you to think about who within your companies, within your partnership consortiums, may be the champion to help drive this message home. And what types of an evidence base do they likely need to be able to really champion these ideas? You know, one of the more successful programs has been in the watershed of Raleigh, North Carolina, where the former mayor there, Mayor Meeker, really took this upon himself to help drive it through the political process and has led to tens of millions of dollars of investment in natural systems for water. And what we have seen is there are a number of enabling conditions that are necessary to make the business case. And there's a lot that we can learn from the dozens of pilot exercises that have happened over the years. The key is, how do we then take those lessons and build them into the way that we're doing business moving forward? And so what we did over the last couple of years is do first-hand surveys and analysis with about 20 different U.S. natural infrastructure programs from across the country. So everything from Arkansas to Portland, Maine, to San Francisco, to the Front Range of Colorado, we dug in deep to understand what were the elements of success, what would you do differently if you were starting over again, what advice would you give companies or utilities who are interested in trying to take this approach to limit their exposure to water risk and create collective action platforms to move this idea forward. And overwhelmingly, what we heard is the single most important thing is being able to make a concrete economic and business case. What is the ultimate return on investment by moving away from the status quo, just traditional built infrastructure, to a more hybridized and holistic green and gray approach? And many of you are likely familiar with the classic Catskills example, where New York City invested in conserving and restoring the Catskills watershed at a cost of about 1.5 to $2 billion, but that was in lieu of needing to spend upwards of $10 billion to build a new treatment plant. We were tired of that example, so we wanted to create a portfolio of other green-gray economic cases where that return on investment could truly be articulated. One place we were able to do that was in Portland, Maine. They were looking at the need to build a new filtration system, would have cost them over $150 million. Instead, we were able to help them understand what could be done on the landscape in terms of conserving certain areas, restoring riparian zones, dealing with fish passage and the regulatory situation to spend somewhere in the magnitude of 40 to 50 instead of 150, a 70% cost savings. This was not just an academic exercise. It was done in close collaboration with the utility, with the forest department, with many of the large companies operating in the watershed, and investment in natural systems has now increased over 25% since this analysis was done in 2013. So really clear analytics factored into decision making and investment. One of the most critical natural infrastructure challenges ahead of us is catastrophic wildfire and unhealthy forests across the western U.S. So unfortunately, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and how severe the next wave of wildfires is going to be this upcoming summer and the summer after that and the summer after that, really for the next 30 to 50 years if we don't change the way that we're managing our natural infrastructure. And if you think about places like San Francisco, Berkeley, and Oakland that are fed by the Sierras, if you think about Denver and Fort Collins and Loveland in the Front Range of Colorado, if you think about Santa Fe, etc., in the Southwest, they are all facing incredible risks from fire and their ability to sustainably manage their water. So a number of years ago, several cities in the Front Range of Colorado had to deal with the aftermath of wildfires which burnt hundreds of thousands of acres. They had to source from alternative reservoirs. They had to replace pipes and systems that literally melted during the fire. They had to replant area where the soils were running into their systems. And this was not just a utility issue. It dramatically impacted breweries, apparel companies, food growing operations who were also operating in that area. And these companies and utilities were then facing tens of millions of dollars of post-fire costs. The plan that we helped them design is to look out 20 years and what can we do differently. And so without going into too much detail, we were able to develop a natural infrastructure portfolio where investment of about $350 million, so still not inexpensive, but if spread across a range of beneficiaries, could ultimately save the cities and companies almost $200 million. So a proactive investment for cost reduction to save massive capital expenditures on the back end. And we were able to help articulate where those cost savings would be generated and which industries would accrue those benefits at what time periods. We've now begun to take this type of analysis and work with companies, work with cities, work with utilities to apply it to whatever situations they may be dealing with, whether in the U.S. or abroad. In Latin America right now, we're working in 4 major cities: Rio, Sao Paulo, Victoria in Brazil, and Monterrey, Mexico. We're working with the FEMSA Foundation, which is the foundation which represents Coca-Cola bottlers in Latin America, a number of other foundations and nonprofit groups to do really detailed economic analyses of what that return on investment looks like when you are able to incorporate a large-scale conservation, restoration, and improved landscape practice for the purposes of improving your water-related services. More sustainable and confident water supply systems, more water for your agricultural supply chains, more water for your hydroelectric facilities, more flood protection for your assets, and the like. This ability to make the business case has been the most clear ingredient to move this from what seems like a really nice idea to something that is a core business strategy. So again, I'm just going to pause for a second, and please don't be shy to ask questions now or ask for anything clarifying, or we can move to the next part if folks are ready.
And just a reminder to clarify on my comments in our last question section here, you have two options. You can raise your hand within the web platform, or you can enter your questions into the chat.
I know
Todd,
everyone.
I thought it was interesting your comment around the post-fire costs that many companies or municipalities may have incurred. And I wonder from those who are on the line if that's something that anyone has a recollection of that maybe did directly impact your business. I'll just leave that for consideration and storytelling at the end. Todd, if you want to keep going.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So just to kind of refresh kind of where we are today, it's understanding what this idea of green-gray water infrastructure looks like. It's prioritizing where are the places and what are the threats that make this approach so attractive. Who really needs to be bringing forth this message to key decision makers, and what does that ultimate return on investment look like of how it's going to impact the bottom line. But one thing we often hear is, how do we finance this type of approach? And that's where we've been spending a lot of time with our partners in the finance section, financial institutions, development banks, and the like, to think through innovative approaches to this concept. And like any good analysis, it starts by understanding what are the current financing and funding mechanisms that are currently being deployed right now. And so we looked across about 40 or so different programs and projects in the US and Latin America and parts of Asia, and try to capture where all the money is coming from foundations, from corporate contributions, from utility surcharges, from the bond market, and the like. And then did detailed surveying with companies, with finance institutions, development banks, etc., to understand what else is needed, either totally new policy and programs, or how could we tweak existing opportunities to make them more attractive and get more investment flowing at the scale that we think is necessary. So there's just two specific financing mechanisms that I'd like to talk about in just a little bit more detail. And the first one is the idea of green bonds that have a natural solutions component. And I suspect that many companies on the line are familiar with the idea of bonding for infrastructure. Many large companies do it for all sorts of infrastructure, whether it's water, energy, transportation, what have you. And there's been a major uptick in the idea of moving from traditional bonds to ones that can truly be classified as green. And there's been a number of green bonds that have been issued over the last half dozen years. But there now is an increased push to understand exactly what it means for a bond to be green. How do we ensure a level of transparency and validation around the process? What do those standards look like? How do we make sure the proceeds are being properly used and the like? So we have partnered, WRI has partnered with the groups at the bottom of this slide here, the Climate Bonds Initiative out of the UK, Ceres, who I suspect many of you are familiar with, work with corporate sustainability, and the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, to develop the first third-party certified standard for green bonds. We issued the first bond against the standard in May of 2016 with San Francisco Public Utilities for about $240 million, and are now talking to a couple of corporations and some additional utilities to think through how we can do subsequent issuances. And I'd love for you to be thinking about infrastructure needs that your company has over the next 2 to 5 years, and would this idea of having a certified green bond be attractive? In the short run, there may not be an absolute price premium on the certification, but what we have found and what has been demonstrated time and again is when you have this green bond associated with your issuance, it dramatically increases the number of investors. So you're increasing the pool of investors. You potentially can issue at a higher raw number. So many of those that have been involved early on have doubled the issuance level. And in some cases, there actually has been a slight reduction on the interest rates because there's a ton of capital out there right now looking to invest in green and natural systems. So this is something that I'd love to think about. Is there a role for your companies to further engage this idea of green bonds for infrastructure? Coming back to the catastrophic wildfire issue across the western U.S., WRI has worked with a group called Blue Forest Conservation and the American Forest Foundation on work that's been funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Moore Foundation. And basically what we want to do is try to restore the forests of the western U.S. back to a more functional and healthy condition. So right now, in a majority of our western forests, they are severely overgrown. So when you do have wildfires, which are a natural part of the system, instead of them playing a positive ecological function and actually helping maintain the water quality and water storage functions of the ecosystems, they severely degrade them because they burn everything in the forest, they sterilize the soil, they often lead to more intense and frequent flood events. They lead to the sedimentation of our reservoirs and ultimately damage the pipelines and infrastructure of our water management. So this idea is trying to be addressed through a funding mechanism called the Forest Resilience Bond. And it looks to tap into private capital to fund forest restoration using both debt and equity. And so the idea is to think about how we use private capital on the front side to go in and do the large-scale forest restoration work that is necessary, and then to derive a return on that upfront investment through a multi-stakeholder platform. So you can think about the Forest Service right now, which has to carry the entire load for maintaining the health of our forests. They may only have to now pay 70%. The remaining load would then be shared by water and electric utilities, who are going to see dramatic risk reduction and cost reduction through healthier forests and reduced impacts on water resources, by corporations like those on the line here, who will recognize immediate and long-term risk and cost reductions, state agencies, and foundations. And so we believe that each of those groups, paying less than they would if they entered into this agreement alone, are then going to get way over 4x on their investment because of how many different groups are geared towards the same solution set. We already have quite a few impact investors who are ready to make investments on the front end, and we have very far along conversations with both the Forest Service and several utilities and even a couple of companies who are interested in being a part of the first projects. So we anticipate that by this time next year, there will be forest resilient pilots in the Sierras, likely feeding some of the major California Bay and Delta utilities and companies, so things San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, and the like. And then also several utilities and companies in the Front Range of Colorado. We also anticipate major benefits beyond just pure ecological resources. So this is going to create quite a few rural livelihood jobs. It's going to create increased public health benefits and a number of other societal benefits that we're looking to be able to measure and monitor, and which I suspect also tie to many of your corporate stewardship goals that you have put in place. Where are the opportunities? What is the return on investment? And how do you fund it? And the how do you fund it piece starts with how do we show some pilots, how do we prove success? But then we quickly need to move from a couple of success stories to really integrating this into policy and scale up to a meaningful level of effort. And there's a couple of ways that we think about this, and this is the last few slides that I'll show before I hope we can have some question and answers and be thinking about, push back if some of the things that I laid out don't necessarily mesh with your worldview or some of the assumptions or realities that you've recognized in your sustainability offices and operations. But to get this to really be implemented at the scale necessary, we've got to think about networks. So we're working with Rockefeller's 100 Resilient Cities. We're working with the C40 Cities Collaboration, with the 30+ water funds operating in Latin America with IDB. We're talking to NABARD, the agricultural bank in India, about how they can incorporate this into their investment structure. And the list goes on and on. We'd love to think through how we can work more closely with corporate consortiums, either across your portfolio or multiple companies working together. And if there's any resource that really does tie us, I think it is water. This advertisement, which is a real collaboration between two competitors, Coca-Cola and Pepsi in Latin America, they realized that they could both do great things independently, but if they were working together with the Inter-American Development Bank, with some of the leading civil society groups and other financial institutions in parts of Latin America, they could do a lot more. So instead of arm wrestling, they're really kind of holding hands toward this vision. And they've seen dramatic risk reductions because of partnerships like this. But it's beyond collaboration that we need to be thinking. We need to understand what are the policy windows, what are the decision-relevant platforms where you and your teams can engage, and what is the timeline for that engagement to really make a difference, and to put the enabling conditions in place to see more of these investments happen. So there's just 3 of the last slides here talk very specifically about ongoing and upcoming opportunities for you and your partners to engage. So this past fall in California, a new bill was adopted by the state of California called AB 2480. And what it does is it very specifically and articulately counts natural infrastructure, so our working forests, farms, and ranch lands, as part of the state's water infrastructure. So this has major implications. It may change the way that utilities can account for natural infrastructure on their balance sheets. So they may be able to depreciate or even appreciate against the natural infrastructure. It should be able to help companies and utilities and cities bond against the natural systems which make up their watershed. It will help them be able to better articulate the risks to their water supply and to rethink the way that they're prioritizing the way that they do business. We would love to have your feedback on the way that this policy is written, and over the next year or so, as we attempt to take the best parts of this policy and the inevitable tweaks that are needed and look to replicate it for other states or other watersheds, think about how you and your partners can engage, because it is a huge opportunity which we would love to be incorporated into the federal level infrastructure and tax rules for the country. There are two very real-time opportunities that we think are going to be important for corporations to pay attention to and to chime in on. One is the 2018 Farm Bill. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with what's in the Farm Bill. You know, some of it deals with commodity crops and crop insurance and the like. I'm less focused on that part of it and more focused on a piece of it which is called the conservation title. Now, the conservation title is the largest financing pool of dollars for working lands in the world. So billions of dollars flow to America's farmers and forest landowners to protect, restore, and manage their land for a host of benefits: carbon sequestration, wildlife, and arguably most importantly, water. There will be opportunities in the 2018 Farm Bill to better articulate the role of natural infrastructure, to set the framework for more public-private partnerships, to look at how we can create loan guarantee programs around investments for natural infrastructure and infrastructure. Most of that right now is being thought of as roads and bridges, which is obviously critically important. But water infrastructure is going to have some space in that bill as well. And we're now working with the Forest Service, with the Department of Defense, with several companies, and we'd love for you to join the team to make sure this idea of green and gray infrastructure can be very clearly laid out in the infrastructure plan. This will open up more funding opportunities, more public-private partnership opportunities, and greater opportunity for you and your partners to think about how to secure these natural systems for your water sustainability and water management needs. And finally, there is a program which is now entering its second year called the Healthy Watersheds Consortium Grant Program. And it is a public-private partnership between the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, USDA NRCS, and the U.S. EPA. And it's looking to accelerate and leverage investments in natural infrastructure. So last year was the first year, and they issued 9 awards which covered 7 states. About $2 million in funding was made available. This is not for protection itself. Rather, it's to put the capacity in place to dramatically leverage consortium's ability to do natural infrastructure protection and restoration at scale. Just the initial 9 projects that were funded are anticipated to protect and restore over 5 million acres of protection, and 30 plus miles of stream. We are now actively looking to supplement the public entities and the U.S. endowment with corporate partners to build this pool of dollars and increase the level of funding that would go towards natural infrastructure and water security. So there's a few companies who have expressed an interest in potentially being part of this, and for those of you who may find this intriguing, I'd be happy to talk offline and discuss what these opportunities may look like in more detail. So you can think about where you have your key plants, your key supply chains, your key partners. Are there opportunities to fund restoration and conservation of natural systems for water security? So I know that was kind of how we're thinking about our theory of change, and I'd love to now have a dialogue with you guys, and please don't be shy of what this means for you, what are the core questions you have, and how can we work together to do some really cool stuff. So thank you for your time, and look forward to the conversation.
Todd, thanks so much for that presentation. We do have a few minutes left on the clock here, so if anyone would like to ask a question and have dialogue among our participants for this afternoon, please do feel free to jump in. While you ponder those questions or raise your hand through the webinar feature, Todd, I wondered if you could, your presentation gave us a great overview of all of the content in a really digestible way, but you also did send with the invitation a couple of links for deeper dive and further reading, including the green-gray economics piece and some of your blogs and reports around finance. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how participants would use those resources if they wanted to dig deeper into the content, or where they would go next?
Sure, it's a great question. So there's a couple of opportunities for next steps. So first and foremost, hopefully, something that I said today really piqued your interest. That you've been trying to work on or think through, how you do a green-gray project in one of the core watersheds where you have a major part of your supply chain or an asset, and you need to make that business case. So, we'd love to set up a follow-up call to kind of dig into that, into more information. But as Emily said, there's a number of resources that were sent out with the invitation that will point you very specifically to examples of cases where we've been able to apply many of the pieces of the approach and the lessons learned that I described, and work you through kind of what issues we tried to address, how we went about it, what was actually realized from the project in terms of acres conserved, money saved, and that sort of thing. So definitely have a look at that, but I think easiest way is just to set up a follow-up conversation to dig into your needs in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Todd. And we do have a question on the line from Vance. Hi, Vance. Thanks for chatting around the Global Forest Watch water, so the intersection of Aqueduct and Global Forest Watch that you gave us a bit of a demo on. Is that currently available, and can you talk about how corporations could interface with it, both accessing it and if there is a cost?
Sure, great question. Thanks, Vance. So a Global Forest Watch water is free and publicly available. So if you literally just Google Global Forest Watch water, or even just my name, there are links on the website which will take you directly to the tool. Once you're on the website, you can either, just like Google Maps, just kind of toggle on the screen until you find the geography of interest. You can type it into the search bar, or you can put in the lat-long coordinates or drop a point. And you can do this for each of your facilities or elements of your supply chain. And then pretty much everything else is automated and it'll work you through the system. There's information and help drop-down bars to work you through what it is you're seeing, why it's there. So, why did we tell you about forest loss and erosion? Why does that matter for a company or a utility? You can find information on the sources of our information and the like. And so you can free and easily do that for any place across your portfolio or supply chain. Now, what we have found is that is really useful for companies, utilities, financial institutions for a first level filter, but oftentimes there's going to be additional attributes that you're going to want to understand how they impact water risk and watershed condition. And so we're now working with a number of companies and federal agencies to do advisory services work to take the free and publicly available information and add on a number of either sensitive information that you have or data sets that we have that are not currently publicly available to do things that can help you prioritize where you may want to focus more discreetly.
Thanks, Todd. And for everyone's reference, we did just answer with the link into the webinar platform, so you can see there water.globalforestwatch.org for your reference. I see that we've got 2 minutes left. If there are any other questions, happy to take those now. Of course, we can send some of this information out as a follow-up. And as Todd mentioned, there's always the opportunity to dig in for a closer, more company-specific look. And in addition to advisory services, of course, CCG members have their 8 hours of tailored advice benefits. So we could start to take a preliminary look using those benefits to understand where you might go next for a deeper dive with Todd. So I don't see any additional questions on the chat, so maybe we'll wrap it up there. I thank you all so much for your time today. Oh, maybe we do, actually. Let me see if I can do the unmute here. Margaret, I believe, has a question. Hi, Margaret.
Hi. Yeah, I actually was just wondering if you had the slides available to send to the team that was participating today.
Todd, are these available to share?
Sure. I will turn them into a PDF and pass them on to Emily and Lindsay to pass out to those on the line.
Great.
Yeah, and
we'll send those out in the next 24 hours.
The green and gray idea that you have on the slides is really interesting to me, but trying to bring that down to more of a individual site level rather than a regional level is something that when I saw that slide, is something I'd like to think about or talk more about.
Yeah, absolutely. We've done that type of analysis at a lot of different scales. So for a specific facility that serves a couple 100,000 people to an area that serves 20 million people. We focus on flood, we focus on drinking water, we focus on climate resilience. So really dependent upon what it is you need to better understand and put a cost around. We've probably had some experience in that regard. We'll be happy to discuss in more detail.
Great, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the question, Margaret. All right. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. I'm happy to send the follow-ups to this group within the next 24 hours, including the slides. And to make any introductions for follow-ups with Todd, you can just let me know of your interest. Todd, thank you so much for your time today presenting your content. And as always, thanks to our CCG members for dialing in. We'll speak with you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.